winter morning when Chinese icebreaker Shuai-Long-2 crossed into waters just 46 miles from Alaska's coastline. American radar stations lit up like Christmas trees. Naval commanders in Pearl Harbor received urgent encrypted messages. What happened next sent shockwaves through military circles worldwide. Before we dive into this geopolitical powder keg, hit that subscribe button and comment below which nation you think controls the Arctic's future, because this story is far from over. The Arctic Ocean has transformed from a frozen wasteland into the world's most contested strategic territory. As climate change melts ancient ice sheets at unprecedented rates, a new frontier has opened, revealing untapped resources worth trillions and shipping routes that could revolutionize global trade. China, despite being thousands of miles from polar regions, declared itself a near-Arctic state in 2018, a bold claim that raised eyebrows across Western capitals. Their investment in ice-breaking technology now rivals traditional Arctic powers, with vessels capable of crushing through ice 9 feet thick while conducting scientific research that many analysts believe doubles as military reconnaissance. The United States Coast Guard detected the Chinese vessel operating in international waters of the Bering Sea during routine patrols in October 2024. The Shuai-Long-2, launched in 2019 and representing China's most advanced polar research platform, was conducting what Beijing called oceanographic surveys. But its proximity to sensitive American military installations, including early warning radar systems and submarine bases, triggered immediate concern. Coast Guard cutters Kimball and Stratton were dispatched to shadow the Chinese icebreaker, maintaining what naval officers call professional distance while monitoring every movement. The temperature wasn't just dropping outside, diplomatic channels were freezing over as both nations calculated their next moves. This wasn't China's first Arctic adventure near American territory. In 2021, Chinese and Russian naval vessels conducted joint patrols near the Aleutian Islands, marking the first time such combined operations occurred in these waters. Intelligence analysts noted the missions coincided with extensive Chinese mapping of underwater topography, data crucial for submarine operations. The 2024 incident escalated tensions further because Shuai-Long-2 lingered longer than previous visits, deploying scientific equipment that American observers couldn't fully identify. Naval intelligence suspected dual-use technology, instruments serving both civilian research and military intelligence gathering purposes. The distinction between scientific exploration and strategic positioning had blurred completely. Understanding why this matters requires examining what lies beneath Arctic ice. Geological surveys estimate the region contains 13% of the world's undiscovered oil reserves and 30% of undiscovered natural gas. Rare earth minerals essential for modern electronics, renewable energy technology, and military hardware exist in quantities that could shift global economic power. The Northern Sea Route, which skirts Russia's Arctic coast, could reduce shipping time between Asia and Europe by 40% compared to traditional routes through the Suez Canal. Control over these waters means control over 21st-century commerce. China's Belt and Road Initiative now includes a Polar Silk Road component, with investments exceeding $90 billion in Arctic infrastructure, resource extraction, and shipping capabilities. They're not just visiting the Arctic, they're building a permanent presence. The American response came swiftly and deliberately. The U.S. Navy deployed the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, USS John Finn, to the region, supported by P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft conducting round-the-clock surveillance. These weren't just observation missions, they were statements of capability. The Pentagon released carefully worded statements emphasizing America's commitment to freedom of navigation, while noting that all vessels near U.S. territory would be monitored continuously. Military analysts recognize the delicate balance at play. International law permits innocent passage through territorial waters, but what constitutes innocent remains subject to interpretation. The Chinese vessel operated legally in international waters, yet its presence represented a strategic challenge to American Arctic dominance that couldn't be ignored. Alaska's geographical position makes it America's Arctic sentinel. The state's northern coastline stretches across 1,060 miles of Arctic Ocean frontage, making it the nation's only Arctic territory. Military installations dot the landscape, from Eielson Air Force Base, near Fairbanks, to the radar stations of the North Warning System. These facilities form America's first line of defense against potential threats from across the polar region. When Chinese icebreakers approach, they're not just nearing one state, they're probing the soft underbelly of North American air defense systems. The Cold War infrastructure built to counter Soviet bombers now faces a different challenge. Chinese intelligence gathering in these waters could map vulnerabilities in detection systems, identify patrol patterns, and test response times, all valuable data in any future conflict scenario. Russia watches this chess match with intense interest and occasional participation. As the largest Arctic nation with the longest polar coastline, Russia has reasserted control over its northern territories with aggressive infrastructure development and military expansion. New bases above the Arctic Circle house advanced air defense systems, fighter jets, and specialized Arctic combat brigades. Russian icebreakers remain the world's most numerous and powerful, including nuclear-powered vessels that operate year-round in conditions that would trap other ships. Moscow has cultivated closer ties with Beijing, viewing partnership as preferable to competing against both China and the West simultaneously. Joint military exercises in Arctic waters serve multiple purposes, demonstrating cooperation, dividing American attention, and normalizing Chinese presence in regions where they historically had no role. The environmental dimension adds complexity to military maneuvering. Arctic ice has declined roughly 13% per decade since 1979, opening previously inaccessible areas to human activity. Scientists aboard vessels like Xulong 2 conduct legitimate research on climate change, ocean acidification, and ecosystem transformation. Distinguishing between genuine scientific inquiry and intelligence operations becomes nearly impossible when the same equipment serves both purposes. Environmental advocates worry that increased military presence and resource competition will accelerate ecological damage in fragile polar ecosystems. Indigenous communities dependent on Arctic resources face disruption from naval exercises, seismic testing, and increased shipping traffic. The geopolitical struggle unfolds against a backdrop of environmental crisis, with each nation claiming to prioritize conservation while pursuing strategic advantages. America's Arctic strategy has evolved significantly since the 2024 incident. The Coast Guard commissioned additional polar security cutters, with Congress allocating billions for icebreaker construction after decades of underinvestment left the U.S. with only one operational heavy icebreaker compared to Russia's 40-plus vessels. The Navy re-established Second Fleet to focus on Atlantic and Arctic operations, acknowledging that these waters require dedicated attention rather than ad hoc responses. Partnership with NATO allies has intensified, particularly with Norway, Denmark, and Canada, nations with significant Arctic territories and shared concerns about Chinese expansion. Joint training exercises now occur regularly in extreme cold conditions, preparing forces for combat in environments where standard equipment fails and survival itself becomes challenging. The economic stakes continue rising as technology makes Arctic resource extraction increasingly viable. Shell, ExxonMobil, and other energy giants have invested billions in offshore drilling platforms engineered for Arctic conditions. Chinese state-owned enterprises have purchased stakes in Russian Arctic projects, gaining both resources and geographical foothold. The Yamal LNG project, partly Chinese-funded, exports natural gas from northern Russia along the Northern Sea route, using specially designed Ice-class tankers. Each cargo passing through Arctic waters reinforces China's argument that it deserves a voice in polar governance despite lacking Arctic territory. The legal framework governing these competing claims remains contested, with disputes over territorial waters, continental shelf boundaries, and navigation rights unresolved after decades of negotiation. Technology has become the new battlefield in Arctic competition. Advanced icebreakers represent only the visible surface of sophisticated capabilities. Underwater drones map ocean floors and monitor submarine activity. Satellite constellations provide constant surveillance of polar regions previously shrouded in darkness and cloud cover for months. Artificial intelligence analyzes vast data streams, identifying patterns and anomalies that human operators would miss. Cyber warfare capabilities target the communications networks and navigation systems that ships depend on in remote waters where rescue is impossible. The nation that masters these technologies gains decisive advantages in controlling Arctic space, making the region a testing ground for 21st-century military innovation. Indigenous perspectives often get overlooked in great power politics, yet Arctic native peoples have inhabited these regions for thousands of years. Inuit, Yupik, and other communities possess irreplaceable knowledge of ice conditions, weather patterns, and ecosystem health. Their traditional territories span national boundaries, complicating sovereignty debates that treat the Arctic as empty space to be claimed. When foreign icebreakers transit near villages dependent on subsistence hunting and fishing, they disrupt migration routes and feeding grounds that indigenous economies rely upon. Climate change already threatens traditional lifestyles. Military competition adds another layer of uncertainty. Some indigenous leaders advocate for greater autonomy in Arctic governance, arguing that nations preoccupied with resources and strategic advantage ignore ecological and cultural preservation. The 2024 incident near Alaska catalyzed diplomatic efforts alongside military preparations. Track 2 dialogues brought together retired officials, academics and military officers from Arctic and near-Arctic states to discuss confidence-building measures and conflict prevention. Proposals included notification requirements for large-scale exercises, communication protocols to prevent accidental clashes, and joint search and rescue frameworks acknowledging that disasters in Arctic conditions require cooperation regardless of political tensions. Progress remains slow, hampered by broader geopolitical competition between China and the United States across multiple domains. Yet the recognition that Arctic conflict could escalate uncontrollably has motivated even adversaries to maintain channels of communication, however strained. As ice continues melting and competition intensifies, the Arctic stands at a crossroads. Will it become another theater for great power rivalry, potentially sparking conflicts that spiral beyond the polar region? Or can nations develop governance frameworks that manage competition while preventing catastrophe? The Chinese icebreaker near Alaska represents more than a single incident. It symbolizes fundamental shifts in global power distribution and resource access. American responses, from naval deployments to diplomatic engagement, will shape whether the Arctic remains a relatively peaceful frontier or transforms into a militarized